Well, good morning. Ooh, I can hear myself. Hopefully you can as well. Give him a second, maybe to turn me down a little bit. But thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I have spent 24 years in education, whether as a teacher or administrator, athletic director, coach. And I've spent a lot of time in front of classes that look a little different from what we've got going on here today. Again, my name is Glen Foster, and we are from Tennessee, originally from North Carolina. But I have family from Evansville, so I've spent an awful lot of time over the years in the area. I have spent also time, like I said, in front of classes, trying to make sure that I don't put them to sleep, and tell them that I will do my best not to put you to sleep if you'll do your best not to go to sleep. So I think today you guys may be a little more appreciative of what we're talking about. I know there's a question and answer time afterwards, but from looking out in the audience, I see veterans and people that know an awful lot of things, probably more than I do. I may want to be the one asking you questions. So if we turn it around and I ask you a question, maybe we'll enjoy that as much. What we're doing today, we've entitled, if it will work, there we go, is See You in a Few Months, an American Guerrilla in the Philippines. I'll tell you a little story as we go through this, the information that hopefully you'll find some interest in. In my classes, I tell them that I want you to go through today and get one thing that makes you go, I didn't know that. If we do that every day of class, we will have over 180 new things that they've learned. So if I can get you all to go, I didn't do that. Hopefully in yours, you might even get a couple. Again, I don't have to talk you into enjoying this because you're here for a reason. And I appreciate you coming. I had no idea what to expect. And the numbers that are here, you obviously are interested in historical things because of your support for this wonderful facility. I know it's probably not just the lunch that you're getting. You were hoping that somebody was going to be here to give you some information that you find worth being here, so that's going to be my effort. To start with, I want to give you a little bit of just a background of what we're talking about in the time frame. When you're talking about things in the war, there is so much information. You can't put 4 years of our involvement into 40 minutes, 45 minutes, because there's so much going on. And this is just in the Pacific. We're not even going to talk about all of the other things that were going on in the Atlantic Theater. So we're going to narrow it down just to some specific places, people, and things that go along with it. But just to give you kind of where we are, we're going to look at from September 1st of 1939 was when Germany invaded Poland. So that was the official start of World War II. You may know that the first shots of World War II in Europe were only 20 years, 9 months, and 19 days after the last shots of the Great War, the war to end all wars. It only lasted 20 years of peace. So just to give you where we are and to start with, December 7th, as many of you know, at 7:55 a.m. was when the Americans were pulled into the war with the attack of Pearl Harbor. By 10 o'clock, the attack ended, and Japanese planes were taken off and headed back to their ships. And obviously, we then are now involved. To show the coordination, there's a lot of conversation about what we knew, what we didn't know, how long were the Japanese planning this. But to show the coordination of what was going on December the 8th, in the Philippines, at 12:40, just after noon, lunchtime area, the Clark Field, which was the primary U.S. Army Air Corps base supporting B-17s in the Philippines, was attacked. To show that there was a coordination, this is only 8 to 9 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. December 8th looks like it's the next day, but for those of you that know how time zones work, you cross the international date line in the Pacific, and it was the next day in the Philippines. And yet it was just literally hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So you kind of get an idea of just where we are. You can see around here the Philippine Islands. Up at the top, the northernmost island of Luzon, is where Clark Airfield Base was. So you just get an idea of where we are and an idea of the timeline that we're talking about. So just kind of keep that one marked. As we move our way through, you can kind of know where we're at. But also, we're going to kind of bounce back and forth a little between people and places. So this just gives you kind of a base to start with. On December the 8th, with the bombing of Clark Field, it was said that one of just the ones I remember from reading, that it talks about they were introduced to the shuddering reality of war. Just the idea of how that's written, it's just, people don't talk in the same ways sometimes nowadays, but you see that this was written in one of the personal memoirs of one of the soldiers. They, at Clark Field, did not have any prior knowledge of that it was coming until the bombs were literally dropping on the airfield. It was discussed in Pearl Harbor of how much we knew, how much we didn't know. It was a similar idea in the Philippines, that they did not have prior warning, even though they did know at the higher up level that what had happened at Pearl Harbor. One of the stories that was spoken by multiple men that were on the airfield that day at Clark was that they were not at our normal stations where they would have been. They were actually listening to radio communications talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor. And they were trying to figure out, is this true? What had happened? What all was going on? So they were literally not where they normally would when the Japanese started their runs. One of the amazing things to hear about talking with any war veteran is their perspective. Part of what I want you to be able to see today is a perspective that they had. When I'm trying to teach my students, again, not like you all, because you have an appreciation. I look out and I see all of you, there's veterans that just have your hats on. I cannot thank you enough for what you did. It's just an amazing thing to be around what truly are heroes among us. Thank you. If I don't see each one of you, then thank you from here. But if I make my way during the day, don't be surprised if I shake your hand and thank you because of my deep appreciation for what you've done. I've grown up in generations of family members that have been a part of the armed forces. Whether it was my father that was in Vietnam, grandfathers that were part of different wars, even back to the War of 1812 and the Civil War and the Revolutionary War on both sides of my family. So for those of you that are Army, then I have an appreciation for you because of personal things. I'm sorry about the Army-Navy game the other day. Some people in here are probably not as happy as others. But we'll keep going to where we are. But that's the idea of what you've done. We want you to be able to appreciate that. And what I'm doing and what our teachers are doing is trying to convey that understanding to our students now. Everybody in here has some connection to someone who was in a war. Your age alone, whether it was my age, your age, older ages, have a connection that our students now have very little. They don't know much about other than history books. And in history books, as you remember, I mean, it's just a story. What I want to do today, and what I do in my classes, is I want to add a connection for a real people. If you don't have that connection, it's just it's a Marvel comic book. You're the Avengers is all that they know about. Like it's just somebody in a story. So today, hopefully, what we'll get out of this is the connection of real people. You know about Douglas MacArthur, General MacArthur, and his great saying of "I shall return" when he left the Philippines. He was the general in charge of the Far East, stationed in the Philippines when the Japanese attacked. And we all know, at some point in time, you've heard of "I shall return." You may have even used that just walking out the door and saying "I shall return," and you may or may not even think about what you're saying. But his saying of when he left was "I shall return." The point of today really is, how did we get from "I shall return" to when he returned? So you know about the "I shall return." You know about him stepping off the boat and headed on to the beach of the Philippines. So what we're going to talk about a lot today, and mostly, is how did that happen? Most people don't even, if you ask them, okay, so tell me what you know about the war. Okay, well, there was Pearl Harbor. There was Douglas MacArthur saying "I shall return." He came back. We bombed Japan and we won the war. That literally is the extent of a lot of our knowledge of our younger groups, just because that's what they've heard in a history book. You all know, because you're from here, and I didn't realize this until much recently, that Evansville was designated a World War II heritage city. If you knew that, which you're here, so you probably know that, because of the war efforts that came literally out of the little city of Evansville, whether it was the LST landing crabs that were made here, whether it was the support, the just production that came out of here, whether it was the P-47 Thunderbolts that, I don't know if you knew, 30 to 50% of all of the P-47 aircraft were built in the city of Evansville. I mean, that's amazing. I know that this is not a large city, and I've grown up at times visiting, and this is not a big city. But for the history to come out of here is amazing. Just to take that into just a consideration is really cool to hear that the city that I know of just from visiting family was that involved. You see the billboards as you drive through, and if you don't know about it, the idea of saying that the city that saved the world is like, come on, like really, like that's a bold statement. Until you actually know what's going on and what came out of here is really impressive. Well, one of the things that came out of Evansville was from Bosse High School, right down the road. As I drive in, I pass by the football field of the Bosse Bulldogs. And I've grown up hearing about all of the different teams and the high schools and things and keeping up with high school basketball. But out of Bosse High School came Lowell Holder. In 1939, he graduated from Bosse, and as with many of that age group, didn't have like a job lined up. I mean, I can imagine that if it's not a big city now, it sure wasn't a big city in 1939. So in order to have an option of what to do and to save for college, which was his plan, he joined the U.S. Army. At the time, he went into the Air Corps. And for those of you that know how it works, the Air Corps was the original Air Force, which wasn't actually established as a branch of the government in the services until 1947. So in 1939 to 1947, the U.S. Army Air Corps was where you went if you wanted to fly planes. So he joins the Army into the Air Corps, goes to Fort Slocum, New York for basic training. Got himself into the options of different things to do, where to go, how to do things, and ended up as an armorer for B-17s. Well, part of that training then sends you to Hawaii. So I'm sure that was where when you get sent to places, some people end up in Louisiana or Texas or who knows where, but when you get stationed in Hawaii, that's probably not the worst thing in the world. And in 1939, there wasn't a war going on when he graduated in June. As you remember, didn't happen until September of 1939. So we're not in war at this time, so just going into the Army was a normal kind of thing for young adults at the time. Well, even by 1940, when he gets shipped to Hawaii, we just now are having war. And if you don't want to be in war, you go to literally the farthest place from Germany as possible, and you end up in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Or specifically, Oahu. So I love pictures of things that have come from the past. And you see this was literally a picture with it marked Oahu, Hawaii, 1941. And Lowell Holder on your right. This is pictured where they were. I said he was an armorer with B-17s. So if you look on the right about there is Lowell Holder with his armament graduation in 1940. As many of you have heard or know, or if you don't know, they just worked on all of the things that had to do with the B-17s. For months, if you see right about here where Hickam Field is, it overlooked Battleship Row that you all know of from the pictures and from hearing the stories of just Pearl Harbor. It's interesting to think that for the better part of a year and a half, as they worked on the airfields there at Hickam, he could look out across the bay and look at the USS Nevada, the Oklahoma, the USS Arizona, and to think of what they didn't know. They had no clue what was coming in the next few months, what was coming for them, what was coming for our country, what was coming from the world. But he literally was working on one of the B-17s and could look across at the ships that were moored there. And it's always an interesting thing, again, to put in perspective of what was going on. His next assignment sent them to the Philippines. So he spent what would be the next 3 weeks on not exactly the Titanic, but it did get there, so there's a plus. Was the President Pierce, is what took about 3 weeks to go across the Pacific to the Philippines, where they then were stationed at Clark Air Base. Clark Air Base was the main Army Air Corps base supporting B-17s. They had the most B-17s at that base of any of the Philippine airfields. So that was where they were working on December the 8th. This gives you a quick idea of what the Philippines looked like. The northernmost, again, Luzon, was where you can see where Clark was. You'll hear different things about most of it, but Leyte is here, where you hear about the Battle of Leyte, and Leyte Gulf was a huge battle, was a part of later in the war. And then down here on Mindanao, you will hear most of what we're talking about. So that gives you just an idea, so you understand where we're talking about. I remember when I went on my honeymoon, we went to St. Lucia in the Bahamas, and we were on the beach one time just talking, and my new wife says, "Where are we?" Like, she didn't even know where we were, and so I literally drew in the sand, kind of, here's where Florida is, and here's where. So I say that only because this gives you at least an idea of where we're talking about. It's on the other side of the world from Evansville, Indiana, and the cornfields. To end up in the Philippines, stories of shore leave of the sailors and all them hanging out in Hawaii to the Philippines was quite a change. Again, on December 8th, Clark Field was attacked. Following that became December 25th, Christmas Day of 1941. They were ordered to leave. So for about a 2-week period after the initial attack, there was every few days there'd be another attack, another bombing, another strafing of the fields. They were working their way down from the northern part of Luzon. They were attacking down in Mindanao. They started literally a coordinated attack to take over the Philippines, because that's where Americans and American airfields were that were able to be used for obviously anything, but our presence, the American presence, was what they were trying to make sure they were getting rid of. On December 29th, they left for Bataan. If you look up here, they left Clark Field and went south to the peninsula of Bataan that overlooked the island of Corregidor. That was on December 29th. Most of us have heard that with 4 months later, the soldiers that were left on Bataan were part of what was captured. That led to the Bataan Death March that saw thousands of our soldiers die in between. The ones that made it then were POWs for most of the rest of the war. So this group, the 19th Squadron, was what they were a part of. Were evacuated to Bataan, and within the next few days, were then evacuated again, leaving Bataan, going south. On many of the different memoirs that I've read, it's amazing to hear the same thing come up. You can really tell what was truth and not made up when you have multiple memories of different people that say the same thing. Much of our stuff comes from 4 main points. There's a really great memoir that is very long by a Corporal Thomas Mitsos that was in this group. We also have had information sent to us by the family of a man named, he ended up being Major. I will say that most of the names that we'll talk about, I'm going to give you the last, what they ended with as far as their rank. So many of these went in as private first class. They ended up as a second lieutenant, then a first lieutenant, then as a captain, all while they were in the Philippines. So I call him by his finished rank of Major Ben Farrens. And then Holder did the same thing, ended up as a captain while he was in the Philippines. So Major Ferens and his family, we have read through and had conversations with since, that have sent us information that he's written. And the same thing with memoirs of Captain Holder, as well as multiple books. If you want to read anything, they're everywhere. But you'll hear a little bit about a man named Wendell Fertig, which will come up. But I say that just because they all mention the SS Mayan. It was just a transport ship that took them from Bataan. They ended up headed to Mindoro, where they disembarked, jumped off the ship into boats, and swam ashore as they were being bombed again. Through what many of them say literally is the grace of God that took care of them, that they did not get hit. So they ended up in Mindoro. They then went to Negros, landed again, same thing, hopped off the ship, swam ashore, got in boats as Japanese bombers were flying around, and finally ended up in the northern part of Mindanao. And this is where the 14th Bomb Squadron was reassigned to infantry. Remember, they were B-17 armors. All of the B-17s were blown up. So you don't need an armor in the Army Air Corps if you're on the ground in Mindanao. So they were all reassigned to infantry. If you see their jackets and pictures, you'll see the infantry pins, as opposed to their Air Corps pins, because wasn't much need for an armor because nothing was flying. The fun thing I get to tell my kids is, look, today I'm a special speaker. I like to call myself in class, I'm a guest lecturer, because it sounds better than sub-teacher. And today I'm a guest lecturer. It just sounds a little better. They don't have to take a test on what I give them, so they listen differently. If any of you have been in front of a class, if you have to take notes, then it's a little more work. But I get to tell them, look, you don't have to take notes today. You just get to listen. Just learn. Again, remember that one, didn't know that. That's what we're going for. If you've gotten one of those so far, cool. If you haven't, there's more to come. But the dates, again, are just to give you a timeline. They're not there to remember and to get all bogged down in, because, oh my gracious, if you've read through some of this, the dates just continue. It's just date after date after date, and they all run together. On March 9th of 42, General MacArthur was ordered by President Roosevelt to leave the Philippines. So the I shall return happened around this date. Because he was the general in charge, he was told he has to leave. So he headed to Australia to set up his headquarters, to then figure out, okay, what's next? There's always a regroup time to figure out what's next. After that, on April 7th, this is the original text messages. For those of you that do like it, some of you are like, absolutely not, I don't like having anything to do with it. But the original text message came as a Western Union telegram. This is the one point that we know of that Captain Holder was able to send word home that, one, he was still alive, and I'm doing fine. So read with me real quick. This was sent. I'm getting along fine. You may cable me here. See you in a few months. This was sent from Mindanao. Now, if you catch the last little part that says, see you in a few months, Lowell Holder. If you remember, the title of what we are talking about today was, I'll see you in a few months, an American guerrilla Philippines. The idea was they were only going to be there a while longer. They'll get shipped out, they'll get transferred, they'll move. That was on April 7th. If you see right there, there's the date. Sent at 3:13 a.m. in the morning. Within the next month, they became detached from their group. They ended up in a group of about 14 that ended up separated because of Japanese attacks at different times. 1 month later, on May 7th, he was officially noted as missing in action. In the hills, in the jungles. But I find it interesting that, again, 1 month to the day after I'll see you in a few months, he's missing in action and would not see them again for an extended amount of time. On May 10th, which happened just a few days later, was officially when the American forces received orders to surrender. Prior to May 10th, when I told you they had gotten away from their groups, and forgive me for all of you that are true Army veterans if I say it wrong. The groups, I know, is not the correct answer, and it's not so. But for those of us civilians, if I say group, you'll understand. From their squadron, they ended up in a hospital there in northern Mindanao. He and a few of his guys that he was with, one of which was Ben Farrens, which you'll hear his name a few times because they ended up going together all over the rest of the war. But they spent time in a hospital for what many of them got malaria. They ended up with all kinds of different ailments because of the jungle. So they bounced around. That's why they were not with their squadron at the time when they were told to surrender. I did not know this until later that if they were told to surrender, your options were surrender, end up as a POW, who knows what after that. Or you could choose not to, but also face court-martialing. And I thought, that's extreme. Like, you get to be a POW, or you could be court-martialed by your government, and that's difficult to kind of wrap my head around. But they didn't. They split off into another lesser numbers of groups and headed into the hills. For the next 7 months, they lived on the land, lived with locals, lived in huts, literally just making it by themselves. Nobody knew where they were. They were not in touch with anybody in America or with the army. And hearing the stories about what they ate, I'm a very picky eater. I would not have made it. Like chicken, cool, that's about it for me, and maybe some burgers here and there, but I would never have made it in the jungles of the Philippines. But he talks about how they had rice mush. That sounds terrible. They said, we could make it for weeks on a monkey leg. Nope, not going to make it. But another story that they said, they lived with a local farmer. And a lot of times, if you know anything about, which I didn't know a lot about it, but there's a lot going on in the Philippines, whether it was religiously, whether it was politically. Like there was a lot of infighting with local people partially because of your religion. The local Muslim Moros were one side. There was a big Catholic group, also believed, and also part of a Christian group. So they were always kind of at odds. So who you were with and who you were friends with made a huge difference. But they were with one of the groups that was sympathetic to the Americans who were anti-Japanese. And they were talking about how one of the farmers, for whatever reason, killed their horse. Not the army's horse, but his horse. And for whatever reason, I don't know if the horse talked back or kicked his son, I don't know. But he shot and killed the horse. And what we would be like, oh, that's a shame. What are we going to do with the horse? If you're living off the land and don't have much food, you go, you know how much we could eat on that horse? That's again, nope, would not have made it in the Philippines. But they said that they literally went out and had enough to eat because of the horse for over a month. And you do what you do. Another thing that I found interesting that I would not have thought of was when Japanese bombs dropped in the area, a lot of times it landed in the water, whether it was the bay or wherever. And because of that, the bombs killed the fish. And the fish would kind of float up on shore. And they didn't have to fish. They could eat for days on the fish that the bombs killed. So it made it easy. So on those weeks, they had plenty to eat because of the horse and the bombed fish. Did not think of that as part of, living on the jungles. But those are the things that now they are involved in. The next gentleman that you may have heard of, and if you hadn't, here's maybe one of those hump moments, was a man named Wendell Fertig. He was originally a mining engineer in the Philippines that later on in 1941 joined the Army and was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel to work in the engineering of the Army base. So his main job was working on aircraft where they were landing at the bases. So upgrading and fixing the airfields was his big thing. Well, around May 10th, he was in Mindanao working on different air bases, possibly at a place called Del Monte Air Base there in Mindanao. Well, he had the decision on May 10th of what to do. He was either going to surrender, which he didn't. He ended up living on the land just like many others. And during the course of his time, he ended up finding that there was a resistance movement growing of local Filipinos against the Japanese. But this is what I found interesting was, I don't know when psychological operations began, but some of you who are Army people, you like to use your shortened versions of PsyOps. My dad worked in psychological operations in Vietnam. And there's lots of great stories, but I think this is one of the better psychological operations I've ever heard of. Wendell Fertig was in the army, and the local people knew that they were not going to get help from the Americans if a local Filipino was in charge. So the idea was, we can tell them that you are in charge. So Wendell Fertig took on the idea of becoming a colonel, not a colonel, he was lieutenant colonel, a general sent by MacArthur from Australia to lead the resistance movement in the Philippines. So they put together this whole story to send out to all of the local areas that a brigadier general sent from Douglas MacArthur in Australia is now in the Philippines, in Mindanao, to help lead. So they send this whole thing out to say that they even fashioned his own stars to put on. Now, those of you that are military know that that's not really a thing. It's really frowned upon. Well, nobody knew about them. Nobody knew they were there. Nobody really cared at the time, but it helped support their efforts. This is the proclamation that was sent out. I'll read it to you because it's a little small. This is from Wendell Fertig to the area people in Mindanao that said, from the United States Army Forces in the Philippines, Office of the Commanding General in the Field of Mindanao and Sulu. The proclamation states, on September 18, 1942, our forces under Major L.L. Morgan, which was the major in the Filipino Army, completed the occupation of Misamis Occidental Province and northern Zamboanga from the hands of the Japanese military government and raised the American and Filipino flags therein. On behalf of the United States of America, the Filipino Commonwealth government is reestablished in those regions under military authorities. And then signed W.W. Fertig, Brigadier General USA, commanding Mindanao and Sulu Force. All of it's made up. The entire proclamation was made up. He's not a brigadier general. He didn't do all of this. What they did was actually go into an area that did not have much or any Japanese presence, ran up their flags, and that was the first victory for General Fertig of the newly moving guerrilla forces of Mindanao. Some of you may have just got your, didn't know that moment. So that's good. So mark that one down. Keep a note. I'd like to see somebody that has 4 or 5 things. But he was originally given orders to help upgrade these things, as I said, and now he's doing that kind of at a different level. So in December of 1942, he has this growing guerrilla movement. All of them at the time were just Filipino nationals. People who were in the area, again, that were resisting Japanese occupation. 3 of Fertig's men left Mindanao, as well as a couple of others that went with them, to try to sail to Australia, which was 1,200 miles away. Yeah, it's a lot of water. With nothing more than a compass and a National Geographic map of the Southeast Pacific. In a 21-foot sailboat. Somehow, again, for those that have their beliefs know that, but by the grace of God, they made it to Australia and actually found General MacArthur's headquarters. They were sent with a code book and call signs of what to expect if they heard from Americans in Mindanao, so they knew that it was them. Like, the idea of that just is mind-boggling. Like, okay, so we have a plan. We're going to send these people off. If we can get in touch with MacArthur and tell them that we are here and have troops, they will send support. Originally, MacArthur didn't believe them. He didn't think this was real. They spent a month or so just sending signals just to test it with no real information that was of use. But that was the idea of the beginning of the American guerrillas of Mindanao. A group of Americans, including Ben Ferens and Lowell Holder, arrived in the area to join what would end up being around 180 American guerrillas as part of this movement. It's talked about that up to 25 to 30,000 troops were all a part of this group just on that island. And the idea that Wendell Fertig was able to pull this in, that became one of the most organized groups of guerrillas in the entire Philippines. There were guerrillas on Luzon. There were guerrillas in other areas, but the most organized and well-known came from Mindanao. Later in February, communication with MacArthur's office had been established. So it was now, okay, now we have something here. And something called the Force Radio Section, or the FRS, proves it was operational and can be vital to the success of the war efforts in the Philippines. Because of this, now we have options. We have ideas that can be sent back and forth. So, okay, now we have a new plan. While this is going on, you find it interesting that seeing real paper that was sent by the United States War Department, I've always been fascinated with. And this is one of the ones that got sent to the family of Captain Holder. It says, "Dear Mrs. Holder, the records of the War Department show your son, Private First Class Lowell Holder of the Air Corps, missing in action in the Philippine Islands since May 7th. Do you see this date? April 7th, they got the telegram. May 7th, he's missing in action in 1942. That says 1943. That's a whole year of nothing. I just can't imagine being the family of armed forces in this time period. Like, there's just no information. Like, they've gone an entire year having no understanding of what's going on with their son. All available information concerning your son has been carefully considered, and under the provisions of Public Law 490, an official determination has been made, continuing him on the records of the War Department in missing status. The law cited provides that pay and allowances are to be credited to the missing person's account, and payment of allotments are authorized. Will continue during his absence." Oh, well, if you just told your mom that your son's missing, we're going to keep paying him, though. Okay, that's not exactly, I think, really comforting words, but it's something. They don't know where he is. They are missing in action, when in reality, in 1943, Holder, Farrens, and the rest of their groups are in a camp putting together the idea of radio stations that would send information to General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. Right here on the end, second from the right, is Lowell Holder, and just to his right is Ben Farrens, who we talk about often. I like the idea of having these connections because I'm getting the same information from multiple sources. It's not just made up here, made up there, oh, I think I remember. Like, these are collaborating to the day on these different memoirs, which is just amazing to me. But that's what they're doing, is putting together these radio stations. They ended up being called Coast Watchers. And the idea of the Coast Watchers, which is really interesting, is that they became spies. They were lookouts on the outer, most of them were on the coast, obviously, to watch out for troop movements and plane movements and ship movements of the Japanese. So this became what they were told from MacArthur, that you're not to engage in fight. The idea of the guerrillas is not guerrilla warfare as much as fighting them to get them out of the way. It was to let them know what was going on. And the Coast Watchers became very important, which this is the part of the middle of I Shall Return and him walking back onto the beach. This is the part that I wanted you to know and to understand why and how this actually happened. Around 30 stations were set up at different times during the 3 years of their operations, delivering nearly 9,000 coded messages a month straight to General MacArthur. Over 40 submarine missions then started delivering 1,300 tons of supplies to these guerrillas. They would come in at night at high tide, be able to drop off supplies, tons at a time. And it's interesting that my kids, when you think of a kid's version of it, they're like, well, why didn't they just pick them up? Like, take them home. Like, take them off the island. They're obviously in harm's way. They're sick. They're having problems. Like, why didn't they just pick them up? And I'm like, here's where you have to think differently than an 18-year-old's mind. The Coast Watchers became integral to the possibilities of not only MacArthur's return to the island, but to the war in general in the Far East. I mean, the Pacific Theater had parts of this as an important part of our possibilities of winning, or because of these coast watchers. They didn't pick them up because the army and the government needed them there. And that's another interesting way of thinking about that. Like, we're in war. You're doing what's best, not for you, what's not best for your mom. It's what's best for the army and our efforts. From 1943 to 1945, over 300 Japanese ships were sunk because of this operation. The coast watchers, in watching their movements, would radio in, and the United States Navy, the subs, the ships, would have knowledge up to a couple of days ahead of what the Japanese were doing. It became a real important thing. This picture from 1948 was from an event of the American Guerrillas of Mindanao, and a meeting that they had where Ben Ferens, who ended up being the president of the American Guerrillas of Mindanao Society after the war, was meeting with Colonel Ferdig. And one of the things he said in one of his war memories was, we had 2 radio stations near a POW camp in Davao to keep an eye on the camp. Every time a Japanese ship would come into the Gulf, Bit Holder, Bit was Lowell Holder, Bit was his nickname. Apparently everybody in the 1940s had a nickname. So Beverly was Ben, Lowell was Bit. That's a whole other story. So Bit Holder, the radio operator in the area, would notify headquarters. It became very evident in 1943 and 44 to the Japanese that the guerrillas were a problem. Because, as I said, 300 of their ships were sunk directly related to this, and they didn't know how or why. But the rest of the end of this is what obviously I found a little bit interesting. Was his recollection of this was, Bit Holder was probably responsible for more Japanese ships being sunk than any other coast watcher in Mindanao. You remember where Bit Holder was from? There you go. Thank you. So you are listening a little bit. He's from Evansville, an Evansville native, the son of a Baptist minister who grew up just down the road, was credited with being one of the top coast watchers in Mindanao at the time by what would become a 3-time Bronze Star winner. Beverly Ben Ferens ended up very well decorated as a part of lots of things, and like I said, was awarded 3 different Bronze Stars. So his recollection and importance to this was obviously evident and real. So as they moved through 1943 and 44, they moved around a lot. The idea was that the Japanese didn't know where they were or what they were talking about, but they could lock on to the radio signals that were being sent off by the radio stations. So that became really one of the worst places to be, because it was bombed and shot at and attacked more than almost any other area in what was going on in Mindanao. So they bounced around and moved often. One of the stories that was mentioned was that Lowell Holder went with Colonel Ferdig from one location to another to set up a new radio station. And it was noted in multiple places that this happened, that Holder went with Ferdig to Esperanza, was the name of it, to set up new ones. So they would have a few of the radio operators that were key to what they were doing, would go with them to then set up a new place. So then they would pack up and leave to go to a new place. But part of it was because MacArthur's information was so important, he sent word that said, you are never to be off the air. Do not, under any circumstance, be off the air. They were sending coded messages 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on what they were doing. So it was constant. So when they would move, they had to go ahead and set up a new station. For then, that one was online and going for when the other one was packed up and left. I mentioned Davao, which was in the southeast portion of Mindanao. This picture was taken at one of the guerrilla airstrips in 1945. Davao was the 3rd largest Japanese base in the Philippines. There was also a POW camp right there, right outside of the city. 6 Coast Watcher stations were established just around the Davao Gulf alone. That's how important it was and how much shipping was going on. So the information was very key to be sending. They knew exactly where to find these ships because of these Coast Watchers. So it became key information to the U.S. Navy over the days. One of the stories that came out that you might appreciate was that one evening they were on one side of the Gulf. It kind of moves around. So you're going from one side of the Gulf to the other. And one of Captain Holder's missions was to send supplies from one side to another. One evening they had to do this at night. So obviously it added to the difficulty, but also that was important because you couldn't be seen as well. So they get into their boat. They use this air canister to start the engine, and it just wouldn't start. Like they tried and tried and tried, they couldn't start. So they weren't going to be able to supply where they were headed across the Gulf. So they ended up staying the night in some hut, out on the beach probably. And the next morning, they were finally able to radio in to find out and let them know what was going on. They didn't hear anything. They didn't, get information. They ended up finding out that evening before, that the area they were going to was attacked by Japanese forces. He says that if it would have worked, if they would have started the boat and they would have driven right into the Japanese attack. Again, on his notes, but by the providence of God taking care of us, that didn't happen. That happens a lot in stories that you'll hear. Again, the stories coming out of wars are just, you can't count them on. You can do an entire class in college just on things we're talking about, that we're putting into 40 or 45 minutes. But the idea of how many times you hear the term, but by the providence or grace of God, I didn't, ... 1945. So we got a note to mom in 1943 saying he's missing. 2 years pass, nothing. No information. But in 1945, they get another information sent to them from the War Department. Dear Mrs. Holder, it gives me great pleasure. Oh, I can't read, sorry. It gives me great pleasure to inform you that a report has been received from the Commanding General of the United States Armed Forces in the Far East, which states that on October 26, 1944, your son, Private First Class Lowell G. Holder, in 1945, he had actually been promoted 3 times to captain, which is, again, moms don't care, was alive and on duty. Private Holder, as you have previously been informed, is carried officially on the War Department as missing in action since May 7th of 42 in the Philippine Islands. I can't imagine the relief of just getting an information saying, he's alive. What was funny was they got another note a week later that said, we regret to inform you. Can't imagine that either. It wasn't he was alive and on duty. He was alive and free because he was not on duty with the American forces. He was not back in the normal operations of the armed forces, but did say he's alive and free. At no point during this time were the members of his squadron ever captured. That's an important thing because it was written in some of his notes that we were never POWs. To some people, that's obviously an important thing if you were part of this at the time. The idea of their work to save and work for the POWs is also equally as important. But they've noted that that was not anything that they had actually been captured. Back to the timeline to catch you up on where we are. We're now in 1944. October 20th, 1944, General MacArthur's troops land on the island of Leyte. Because of the information that they received from the guerrillas over the course of 3 years, it was finally at the time that the forces were not what you would think as much stronger than what we had. So they took the information of the Coast Watchers and the guerrillas and landed on the island of Leyte. You can see the picture is one of the ones you'll see in every history book. It was MacArthur's return to the islands. This was actually on that island. On January 9th of 1945, General MacArthur's troops land on the northern island of Luzon. Manila, the capital, was there, and that was one of the places that General MacArthur was when he had to leave. He called forces and generals that he worked with to get on his boat, for when they landed on Luzon, he made a big statement That's the one that you see even more so, is that one. I thought this picture was interesting. This may be a moment. Look at the cropped picture that you see in the history books. Outside, it looks a little different. Like, we've got a guy here taking pictures. We've got a guy here that obviously does not know what's going on. And we've got the general of the Far East walking on the shore. This was a major, major, major moment, not just in the Pacific theater, but for the United States as a whole. This picture was one that was sent out in time as one of the greatest pictures ever, because it showed what we did. It showed what we were doing. It showed that we were the United States Army. And that picture by itself is just quite a display of what went on. Again, from I shall return to this, all that went on to get there is very important. March 8th of 45, American troops arrive on Mindanao. I can't imagine being the guerrillas of Mindanao that have spent the last 3 years doing what they're doing, being chased and bombed and shot, to see our troops just literally waiting onto the shore. It's just another one of those, when you think about it and you put your reality of it. It's not a story that you just read. It's not just something that happened 500 years ago. To know that we had our men that could literally watch our troops walk onto the shore must have been one of the most exhilarating things they ever experienced. July 25th of 1945, the Japanese resistance collapsed, ending the campaign on Mindanao. The late Coast Watchers informed MacArthur that a half a dozen barges full of Japanese soldiers were headed in the direction to attack where they were landing, when he was landing on that central island of Leyte. I say this because, due to the information, American P-38s and P-47s were able to sink all 6 of those barges, and not one Japanese troop landed on the shore. And no American losses happened in that one battle. The importance of that, because of what these guerrillas were doing. They may not have been the only thing that made this work, because of the work all the way around for everyone. But the guerrillas on Luzon, the guerrillas on Leyte, the guerrillas on Mindanao were a really, really important part of this. And most people have no idea. My goal is hopefully that if you didn't know this, you're leaving today with a, okay. And it's worth sharing. It's worth talking about. It's worth explaining on the importance of what was going on just in this one little section. August 6th, Hiroshima. August 9th, Nagasaki. And you see the ball rolling now. August 15th, Japan surrenders. General MacArthur, on September 2nd, was one of the ones that signed the document that accepted the instrument of surrender of Japan on the USS Missouri. The person that was able to sign, literally to say the war is over, got his information to make that happen by the guerrillas of Mindanao. That included somebody that lived down the street in Evansville, Indiana. To be a part of that and the history, not because of the person specifically, but because of what they were able to do. My favorite part at the end of movies is, okay, now what? What happens now? What happened next? Like, you have the little things show up and, 27 years later, they are now teaching at it. Okay, so what happened? What did he do? Now, captain, see the captain's bars? And the infantry things, the infantry pens. Captain Lowell G. Holder came back to Evansville after spending a month at an Army hospital, 3 weeks on an Army hospital ship on its way back to San Francisco, and another 2 months in San Francisco recovering from the multitude of problems that you get by living in the jungle. I can't imagine that. Again, I don't eat things. Wouldn't have made that. Wouldn't have made it through malaria and dysentery and tapeworms. Gosh, like, it just keeps getting worse. And somehow, these guys managed to come home. So in 1946, he ends up back in Evansville as my daughter says, looking like Captain America. And in the movies, Captain America finds his, in Avengers, in Marvel world, he finds his Captain Carter. My daughter has this picture in her room because she just finds it amazing. She meets a lady named Joyce Reinhardt who lived here. She actually worked at Republic Aviation during the war. So many of you know about that or know somebody things because that is an Evansville thing. She actually qualified as a female flight candidate to ferry planes that were built here like that. But because of the end of the war and some other things, it never came to fruition. But that was the involvement everybody in Evansville had during this time period. So they end up getting married. It's just one of those, it's like an American story. It just looks like it could be in a movie of this is what it looked like in the 40s. It looks different now. Most of you are like, yeah, it looks different now. But those are the things that he ended up going to college. The newly created GI Bill helped pay for his degree at Indiana University. But of all the things that he was able to do, so a 2-time Bronze Star winner, decorated veteran of World War II, accomplished professional, degree from Indiana. He ended up working, for those of you that have been around a while, he worked his way up in the Whirlpool Corporation to a point that he was a corporate vice president of procurement that worked right down the road at the Whirlpool plant that at the time was one of the largest industries in all of Evansville. So just to give you kind of just the timeline of what happened, he lived a very good life. Was involved with lots of things in Evansville, on the boards at the University of Evansville, and Wellborn Hospital, at Triple T Youth for Christ. He was a part of lots of things. But I do want to read you something I think you might find interesting. If you don't, then just nod. This was taken from a part of the American Guerrillas of Mindanao, had reunions every few years. And the ones that were still alive and around would send in information to tell them what was going on if they couldn't be there. So this was from June of 1977, written to Ben Farrens, who happened to be the president of the Reunion Society. And it says, from Lowell G. Bittholder, Dear Ben and family, thanks for the birthday card. I am on such a fast track, I almost missed it. Getting to the point where I'd rather celebrate someone else's. Everyone is fine here. Business is good. I have 3 kids in college, and Carolyn, my oldest, made me a grandpa last December. Have to get used to living with a grandma. Best wishes, Bit. I say that because of the decorated war veteran, business school, Whirlpool vice president, that in 1977, apparently he became a grandfather. Now, I don't know what his favorite part of life would be of his accomplishments, but I'd like to think that might be it. If not the highlight, at least really high up there. I say that because, as you may or may not have heard at the beginning, Carolyn had a son in 1976 to make him a grandpa. This was about 1977. I'd like to think that he was really happy of that moment because that's me. On December 25th of 1941, he was on a ship from Bataan, escaping Japanese bombs. On December 25th of, pick a year from 1976 to 1997, he's sitting in a living room reading the Christmas story to me and my 11 cousins, or leading the music of a cantata at Memorial Baptist Church, or a host of other things of parties that he hosted that I just remember seeing him as that. And to be able to share his story with an amazing group of people like you is very much a privilege and an honor. So thank you for being here. You had no idea what you were getting into. And I appreciate the fact of that you're interested in history and in doing this and supporting an amazing place like this. I do want to thank the Evansville Wartime Museum and each of you for being here. Thank you for your support of this. It's been amazing to be here, see things, to be a part of just seeing what's going on here. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., we've been recently, and I can't wait. I'm actually going as a chaperone for a middle school trip to Washington, D.C. in March. If you've ever been there or want to go, there is one of the newer, not exhibits, one of the newer areas that they've got there that are supporting what's going on is the World War II Memorial. If you've ever seen it, there is an area on this side that talks about all of the battles in the Pacific. If you go on the other side, it talks all of the battles in the Atlantic. And it has mentioned all of the 50 states that are there. I've got a picture of the one that says Indiana. I've got a picture there of the one that says the Philippines. And inscribed in marble are the words Pearl Harbor, Bataan, Corregidor, and Mindanao, as well as all of the others midway in those that were happening. And it's amazing to sit there and put my hand on it and know this story, to understand what actually went on, as opposed to just, oh, that's a pretty building. Oh, that's a pretty memorial. That's nice. But to literally put my hand on Mindanao and what it means to the country, to my family, and to Evansville is quite an honor as well. So thank you all. I didn't see too many falling asleep. I do appreciate that. I didn't have anybody in the audience with actually. So hopefully you got a couple of those, didn't know that moments. So again, thank you for your support here. Thank you to the museum. And I appreciate it. And I wish you all a very, very Merry Christmas. And thank you again.